Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clement Sedmak, and I serve as director of this institute. As many of you know, the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv and the whole country of Ukraine are dear to us here in Notre Dame. Our president, Father John Jenkins, bestowed the Notre Dame Award on Archbishop Boris Kuciak in 2019. And this May, Archbishop Boris, the highest-ranking Ukrainian Catholic prelate in the United States and president of Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, has been our commencement speaker. Ukraine is a country with a face for us in Notre Dame, for us here at the Nanovic Institute. And this is even more so the case since we welcomed 10 students from the Ukrainian Catholic University to campus this summer. They will spend the fall semester here with us. Just last Thursday, the students organized a moving and rich panel to talk about their experience of the war. On February 24th, 2022, Ukraine became a target of Russia's military aggression. The largest war in Europe after World War II broke out, with unimaginable atrocities, suffering, large-scale migration, but also resilience, heroism, witnesses to faith and freedom, and martyrdom. I've repeatedly heard the phrase from Ukrainian friends and colleagues, "We were shocked, but not surprised." To be honest, I was surprised. I naively thought that the diplomatic ties between Russia and the rest of the world would ensure a peaceful negotiation of differences. I naively thought that the diplomatic efforts to engage with what has been called Russia's security needs would be successful. Well, diplomacy has failed in preventing the invasion and the human tragedy and the massive loss of infrastructure. Diplomacy is sometimes defined as the art of maintaining peaceful international relations. The Nanovic Institute is developing diplomacy as a key area of interest. In the field of science diplomacy, for instance, there's a debate right now whether ties with Russian academic institutions should be severed or not, and whether connections with Russian colleagues in sometimes long-term projects should be cut or not. There's also the question whether non-military diplomatic responses to the current situation stand a chance to end the war. What can diplomacy do? What has diplomacy done? Why has diplomacy failed? What is the hope diplomacy can give us? What effect has the war had on other diplomatic missions, relationships, and endeavors? These are the questions that we want to explore in our 1-hour panel. I'm very grateful to our 4 distinguished panelists who will help us navigate this topic. I will very briefly introduce them. Ambassador Audra Plepte is the ambassador from the Republic of Lithuania to the United States. She has also served as permanent representative of Lithuania to the United Nations Permanent Mission. She has served as director of the European Union Department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Vilnius, and as head of the International Missions and Conflict Prevention Division of the same ministry. Welcome, Your Excellency. Thank you so much for being with us. Lord David Alton of Liverpool has been on campus in a memorable visit as our Nanovic Forum speaker in February. He's a member of the House of Lords in London, a human rights campaigner who is banned from traveling to China, and an author of many books on delicate topics such as genocide and the political assessment of North Korea. Welcome again, Lord Alton. Thank you for being with us. Ambassador David Malcolm Robinson is a retired career member of the US Senior Foreign Service. He has served in many roles in the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Iceland, Paraguay, Bolivia, Guyana, where he served as ambassador and representative to the Caribbean community in Afghanistan and Bosnia. His final appointment was Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Civilization Operations. He has also been diplomat in residence here at the Keele School of Global Affairs. Welcome, Ambassador Robinson. Thank you for being with us. Miroslav Marinovic is a Gulag survivor, a human rights activist, and one of our spiritual heroes. He is Vice Rector for University Mission at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv after having fought for the Ukrainian cause for decades. He's the author of 6 books, including his memoir, The Universe Behind Barbed Wire. Miroslav has been our Nanovic Forum speaker in October 2021. It is an honor to have you with us, dear Miroslav. Thank you. Dear audience, each panelist will offer an input of about 8 minutes. The order of speaking will be the following: Lord Alton, Ambassador Plepte, Ambassador Robinson, Vice Rector Marinovic. After that, we will have time to engage with questions and comments. As you know, you can submit questions using a button located on the Nanovic event webpage. Please make use of the Google form to ask questions. So again, welcome all, and please, Lord Alton of Liverpool, dear David, if I could give the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Clemens. And it's a great privilege for me to be with you on this panel of such distinguished speakers today. It was Winston Churchill who famously said that there are moments for more jaw rather than war. But he was well known, of course, as someone who was no appeaser. In fact, throughout the 1930s, when so many people were looking for diplomatic solutions with Adolf Hitler, he was preparing the nation for conflict and a willingness to fight for their freedoms against Nazism. So we should always use diplomacy where we can, and we should always talk, certainly, but we shouldn't do it from a position of weakness, and we must be ready to fight as well when that becomes necessary. You'll hear from Miroslav in a few moments, and also from Her Excellency, the Ambassador of Lithuania. I was in Lithuania recently and went up to the Belarus border, and it reminded me of the Cold War period, of the struggle of the Baltic nations to gain their freedom. But I also visited Ukraine during that period in 1988. And it's interesting that Miroslav, of course, has such a distinguished record, not just as someone who suffered in the gulags, but also in the building of the Ukrainian Catholic University, which has been such a symbol of the freedoms that were gained during that period. But in 1988, when I went to Lviv, I met a bishop, for instance, Pavlo Vasilik, who'd spent, I think, 17 years in Prem in Soviet prisons. Ivan Gel, 18 years, the chairman of the Committee for the Defense of the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine. I met a young priest who was with him who had been to Chernobyl because he'd been caught celebrating the liturgies. He'd been sent there to clear radioactive waste. And I saw people coming out on the streets with their yellow and blue flags, protesting, demanding freedoms, liberties, privileges, democracy, all the things that we often take so much for granted. And I was thinking about these stories and during my visit to the Baltic states, because it reminded me what it was that people had desired, were willing to sacrifice so much for, even to the extent of not just loss of freedoms, but loss of life as well. And the idea, therefore, that the Russian soldiers were going to walk into Ukraine and the streets were going to be littered with flowers, welcoming them and flags waving and asking for the embrace of the Kremlin was absurd from the beginning. And we all saw what had happened in Crimea, and we knew that in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, that we were going to see precisely the same things all over again. So the moment for diplomacy certainly was there, when maybe there could have been proper discussion, debate, maybe even a legitimate plebiscite in Crimea to determine what people's real wishes were. But things were done by force. And I think that inevitably has changed the circumstances and the realities of the ground. And as we meet today, we have to think about even what's been happening in the course of the last 7 days, and then ask your question, well, is it time for Georgia, or is it time for more war? And if so, what must we do to support President Zelensky and these courageous, brave Ukrainians who have been fighting for their freedoms? Firstly, it's difficult to see how with Putin in the Kremlin, there can be a diplomatic initiative that will succeed. After all, this is a man who in the course of the last 7 days has been threatening us again with the use of nuclear weapons. This is a man who has been responsible for the seizure of vast swathes of territory of a sovereign nation. This is a man who in the last few days has secured the semi-mobilization of some of his population, although it's extraordinary to see the traffic queues of people, young people trying to leave the country rather than fight in a war that they know they should not be fighting. This is also someone who's been responsible for the most appalling blackmail of Western nations through the use of gas and energy supplies, who has been trying to blackmail particularly countries like Germany that are so dependent on Russia for their energy needs. And perhaps going back to my own Nanovic lecture at the beginning of this year, this is a man who's also now, think about Mariupol, think about Bucha, think about the wretched crimes that have been committed. This is a man responsible for war crimes and arguably for genocide as well. In May of this year, the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy published a legal analysis of the serious risk of genocide in Ukraine and Russia's incitement to commit genocide. The report follows the growing body of evidence of Russia's atrocities in Ukraine. The report makes two important findings of the existence of a serious risk of genocide in Ukraine and of the direct and public incitement to commit genocide. The report cites a litany of open source data in relation to both findings, including evidence of mass killings, of torture, the use of rape and sexual violence, and the deportation of children. Here was a story again that featured in our newspapers only in the course of the last week. Children who have been abducted and taken away from their own families to Russia. And there's much more as well that I could say as well if people want to explore this further during the Q&A. I say it because all of these things are now on the table. The nuclear threats, the abductions of the children, war crimes, genocide. Blood and treasure has been expended by the brave people of Ukraine. This is Putin's war. He began it. And the only way now for diplomacy, in my opinion, is for other sane Russian leaders to see that this man is not just bad, he's probably mad as well, and that they need to remove him. And that is the point for me when I think it might be possible for diplomacy to start to work. Putin massively miscalculated. They expected to get into the Ukraine, to speed across to Kiev. They expected to put a puppet government in place of the kind they have in Belarus. They expected it all to fall like skittles. What would be really arrogant now is for Western nations to think that they in some way, because of energy crisis or the cost of living rising, that somehow they have the right to start opening negotiations with Russia. That cannot take place unless Ukraine itself thinks the moment has come, given that they've now seized 3,000 square miles of territory, which have been illegally taken by Putin. They've now reclaimed that territory. We can see that their heroism has been bringing them the right rewards. None of us like war, but this is the moment to fight. It isn't the moment now to become appeasers.
Thank you so much, Lord Orton of Liverpool, for these two very strong statements. You do not see any diplomatic possibilities as long as Putin is in office, given the developments over the last 7 days and whatever is on the table. And also it's up to Ukraine to tell the world when it is time to enter diplomatic negotiations. Thank you so much for that. Ambassador Order Plepte, if I may, Your Excellency, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I also wanted to thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. And it's my great pleasure to joining the Nanovic Institute, but also such a honorable panel of speakers there. So if speaking about diplomacy and what has been done and what is now we're, how to assess this situation, we hear now recently that referring about that the Baltic countries or Poland or something, we were right. We were right talking about Russia or thinking about Russia, what is that? And unfortunately, we do agree with that. We wouldn't like to be right in this sense. We probably would have preferred to be wrong sometimes, but we knew that it's might such things as on 24th of February happen, that could happen. But I wanted to also refer on the previous, what has been done, that about possible Russian aggression, the US side started to speak already some months, I think last October or November, something. It was not only us Baltics speaking how dangerous Russia would be, but they was completely speaking and trying to perceive first Western countries, but also there were so many attempts to have contacts with Russia, this Putin regime, and in many different levels, to say, to stop any invasion and war. When nobody even believed, or very few people believed, but anyways, all the attempts were good. So I would say that really all the possibilities, all the means of diplomacy, of this having relations with and contacts with the Russian side was used before the 24th of February. So, and I think here we do support that. So we were a bit skeptical. We thought that it's, how to say, it's not possible to talk always, because sometimes you have to show strength as well. It's not only willingness to talk. But this, at least this time, was really used every single opportunity to talk and perceive, not just start the full-scale invasion to Ukraine. Unfortunately, we see it didn't work. And that is, so that's why we have to talk when it's possible, but we have to be active and to take other all means possible when we see that words don't help. And I'm afraid we are in this situation now when words don't help. And that was, but I could say that also diplomacy was winning even in this situation. What was done before the war and in the very beginning of the war, that diplomatic efforts, the context between like-minded countries, Western countries, was really helped to have a wide coalition which supported Ukraine from the very start of the war, or even I would say before that, to helping them with the weapons, submitting weapons, after that even training, before it was training the military, after that military help all the possible ways, also putting sanctions on Russia. It was unprecedented that it's not only European Union or US put sanction on Russia, which was the clear aggressor in this unprovoked war, but also transatlantic allies were joined by such countries as Japan, Australia, South Korea, Canada. That was also big efforts of diplomacy of doing that. That's understanding who is the victim here and who is the aggressor, and that we have to use all the possible means to stop this aggression. I think that the President Zelensky did huge efforts as well. He really showed the big leadership in also generating support for Ukraine in this war from the very beginning of the war, not only through the other like-minded countries, Europeans or something, but throughout the world. So that is also his big advantage, and what also the people of Ukraine show, that they have to stand up against aggression. Nobody expected probably, or many underestimated Ukrainians will to fight, and Putin himself, Russia himself, and they showed that they can do that. And I think that's the best thing what happened, and we have to all continue supporting that. I know that the war is tough, it's very difficult, but we shouldn't give up, because the war what the Ukrainians fighting, they're fighting in their own territory for their lives and territory for their families, but also they're fighting for all our values, democratic values, because this war and this Russian aggression also showed very clear division between democratic world and authoritarian worlds as well. So it's very good that US leadership, but it's also the European countries and other help what is possible for Ukrainian military, financially, training, and also taking care of refugees. That should be continued. But we have to be also to keep united. And Russia is also understanding that Russia uses other means, not only military, not only weapons, and the people is now with the mobilization they started, so that they don't show any signs of negotiations or trying to get into diplomacy and looking for the peaceful solution of that. On the contrary, they're putting the last person probably with the mobilizations, so they show that they want this conflict to continue, this war to conflict and go that. So we have to take that into mind. And now, as I mentioned, not diplomacy, but to have all the acts, all means to act in the war scene. But a part of that, there's also other misinformation, disinformation, propaganda trying to do. We have to do also to tackle these things at home. Food security. The African many continents are using already suffered from the shortage of food. And there was a big effort, diplomatic efforts as well, to let the grains leave Odessa port from Ukraine. But we also have to explain to the rest of the world why this food shortages. It's not the Western sanctions, but that's because of Russia stopped and didn't allow go Ukraine, and they don't submit their own grains or fertilizers as well, which were not even sanctioned, but they're so necessary for the rest of the world to have appropriate grains and everything. Another thing, they started this referendum as well, so that's we have to tackle those things, which is cannot be accepted when you have referenda in the occupied territories, which we now see when with Bucha, now Izum, the latest things when we see how the civilians are treated there and how many tortured and disappearing, killed, and from the kids and women and men. So that is really, I think they have to, it's not time for the talks. I think it's more time for the tribunal, the war tribunal as we had for the former Yugoslavia, Nuremberg.
Thank you.
I'm very clear on that as well. So I think it's now, as I mentioned, we have to now still act and to see, and as the Lord as well mentioned, if there's any talks, so that should be the Ukrainian side which decides when and how to talk, and the whole community should be ready for that. And the last one, maybe on the energy thing as well, that would be very tough for the whole Europe probably because of the energy prices and some, how to say, our belief or some other countries' belief in diplomacy, and they're having that good and so dependence on the energy supplies and other chain of supplies, something like that. But we have to, I think, survive that. At least we have our eyes open now. How is that? And to be prepared more independent and really to do that. So that's
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, Ambassador Plevti. So I took 4 main messages away. There were so many attempts in the diplomatic realm before the invasion. There is a huge need for diplomatic efforts now. There was a diplomatic effort in the Western and even beyond the European Union, sanctions against Russia, and President Zelensky is doing an excellent job, and that's also one way of doing diplomacy. It means Russia is employing now, make diplomatic efforts, food security, keeping the sanctions up even more important. Thank you so much. Now I would ask Ambassador David Robinson for his statement, and again, thank you for being with us, Dave. Floor is yours. You're still muted, Dave. You're still muted. Please unmute yourself. It should be at the left bottom, the mute button. You're still muted, Dave. Dave, on the left bottom side of your screen should be.
I got the button. It just wasn't going. So excuse me. I'm at the age where technology defeats me frequently. So here we are. Thank you, Clemens, very much for inviting me to join this panel. I appreciate it. And I want to associate myself with the comments made so far, and perhaps to add just a little more perspective on the practice of diplomacy, because I think I would take some exception to the idea that diplomacy has failed when conflict begins. I don't think that's an accurate description of diplomatic practice, at least. I don't think diplomacy is really a sui generis activity, a standalone activity. It's a tool. It's a hand made of policy and politics and strategy. And there's an awful lot, the time for using that tool, I don't think is anywhere near past in Ukraine. And it is still very much, as the ambassador just mentioned, a very active part of what's going on around the country. So I think it's, or around the world right now. So I think it's useful to look at the practice of diplomacy regarding Russia's invasion from at least 3 different perspectives. And one is the Russian efforts at diplomacy. And if you believe that diplomacy really has, at least the practice of diplomacy rather than the theories of diplomacy, if it really has 2 fundamental reasons or 2 fundamental purposes, the first would have to be to increase understanding. It's one thing to go to war on purpose. It's another thing to blunder into it. And what diplomats try to do is to decrease the opportunity for mistakes and to increase understanding among all of the parties. Sometimes that's in order to enjoin conflict, not to avoid conflict. Sometimes it is to stop conflict. And the other, of course, is suasion, to convince others to join your side, to shrink the areas of disagreement, to expand the areas of agreement. So looking at diplomacy as a tool to increase understanding and avoid making mistakes, if we look at Russia's diplomacy leading up to the invasion and through the invasion, I think we'd have to conclude that it was a massive failure. I think Putin and his team grossly underestimated the West and others' resolve in the face of this kind of aggression. And I think that he grossly underestimated NATO's resolve to respond to this. And so I think they have failed miserably. I think they perhaps did blunder in. I think it's an open question to a certain extent as to whether the use of force by the Russians in this case was designed as a simple conquest. They really wanted to go in and take over Ukraine, or was it coercion? Was it to push Ukraine away from a Western-leaning position? Was it to, once again, move Ukraine away from NATO, to move NATO away from Russia's borders? If that was the case, it failed spectacularly. Now that we see Finland and Sweden clamoring to join NATO, that we see, if anything, people have gathered around Ukraine to support Ukraine. And that happened in part because of diplomacy. It didn't just happen spontaneously. A great deal of diplomacy went into work to build this coalition that has now stood firmly against Russian aggression. And I think it's quite clear that Putin, who appears to be terribly isolated, and his diplomatic efforts, whether it's through shows of force or not, have grossly misunderstood and underestimated the rest of the world, frankly's resolve to respond to him and to contain him. I also think that this invasion follows a pattern that has gone on, since long before NATO. You can go back to Finland in 1939. You can go to the North Korean invasion of South Korea in 1950. You can go on. It's been going on for a long time, where Russia has done this kind of thing. But the proximate cause may be, you can link back to NATO and the fact that Putin feels that he has to push the West away and offer a different alternative structure to the traditional institutions that post-World War II institutions. And he's failed to do that. If anything, many of those structures have been strengthened by his recklessness in this case. From a more Western or global perspective, I think diplomacy has been in many ways successful. Yes, it did not stop. With the Minsk agreements and others, it did not stop Russia's aggression. On the other hand, I think from the US, and perhaps I won't speak on behalf of Great Britain, but from the British and other perspectives, it was successful in saying, President Biden was, I think, quite successful in saying, look, we're not going to be dragged into a shooting war over this. We're going to keep this contained right now as a European conflict. We're not going to let you expand this war beyond to suit your needs. You're not going to pull NATO into this to prove to the Russian people that NATO is a threat, which it is not to Russia. And they've been very successful in avoiding that against some odds. And I think that has been a remarkable achievement. Furthermore, if Putin was hoping to offer the BRICS, that Brazil, Russia, India, and China, as an alternative sort of pole of power, multipolar view of the world, he's failed there miserably as well. And they too have joined, at least more quietly, but they appear to be leaning in the direction of saying, look, this is a very bad idea. You should not have done this. And so the diplomacy on the part of the non-Russian diplomacy, I think, has been somewhat successful in thwarting Putin's efforts and in keeping Ukraine whole and continuing to protect not only its sovereignty, but its identity, its separate identity, and its alliance or its affinity to the Western values that the ambassador was just speaking about, and that they're defending so well. I think it's very important. And it's not lost on any of us, I don't think, that this panel is happening in the shadow of the UN General Assembly. And listening to speech after speech after speech at the General Assembly, it's quite clear that Russia and Putin are increasingly isolated as this is happening. So on the one hand, diplomacy has been extraordinarily active. The moment has not passed in holding together a response to this aggression. I think that's quite clear. Russian diplomacy, I think, has failed miserably, in part reflecting the fact that its leader, Putin, is a terribly isolated individual who does not understand what he was up against and has blundered into a conflict, perhaps, that was so ineptly prosecuted that you have to wonder if he intended ever to actually do it. I mean, he was never going to win this the way they started it. It wasn't a blitzkrieg, it was a mess. And every military expert in the world has looked at this and said, this is unthinkable. What he tried to do. And so, as a diplomatic effort, he failed, I think. The global effort led by most of the countries of the West has been relatively succeeding in the face of this kind of aggression. So I think diplomacy is alive and well, and it's important to say that now because of Putin's insistence on resurrecting the threat of some kind of theater nuclear weapons. It's very clear that, and I'm sure in the United States, certainly we've seen President Biden and Jake Sullivan and others issue very strong statements, open a back channel to the Russian government as well on this. Other governments are doing the same thing. And I think we are pursuing diplomatic channels to make sure this doesn't escalate out of hand aggressively. So I think diplomacy is alive and well in this context.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Robinson. What I take away is diplomacy has not failed when conflict begins. So it's a tool, and we have to keep that in mind. And whereas Russian diplomatic efforts have failed, you see a lot of success in the Western or global diplomatic efforts, including the US efforts to keep the conflict contained. Thank you so much. Now, our voice from Ukraine, Vice Rector Marinovic. Miroslav, may I please give the floor to you? Thank you.
Thank you, Clemens. Now this is my turn to express my gratitude for the invitation. It is a true honor for me. I will talk about the achievements and losses of the Vatican's diplomacy in the Ukrainian issue, of course, limited only to modern times. Ukrainians do have reasons to be grateful to the Vatican's diplomacy, if only for the fact that, thanks to it, the then head of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, released Metropolitan Yosef Slepy, who by that time had already served 18 years of hard labor in the Soviet Gulag. It was a gift of Nikita Khrushchev to US President John Kennedy, who in turn wanted to thank Pope John XXIII for his mediation during the so-called Caribbean crisis of 1962. In general, this mediation was almost the pinnacle of the achievements of the Vatican's diplomacy in the 20th century. The three sides managed to avert the real threat of nuclear war. The second glorious page of the Vatican's diplomacy was opened by Pope John Paul II, who in the year 2001 made his official visit to Ukraine. What was important was that with this visit, the Pope interrupted the international isolation in which the then president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, fell, bearing alleged indirect responsibility for the murder of journalist Georgy Gongadze. President Kuchma appreciated the Pope's gesture and in turn also assisted the Pope because due to the opposition of the leadership of the Orthodox Church in Moscow and Kyiv, the Pope's visit could not be exclusively pastoral. This is why Leonid Kuchma invited Pope John Paul II as the head of the Vatican City State. So the visit was official. Thus, the combination in the person of the Pope of the functions of the head of the Catholic Church and the head of the Vatican City State turned out in this case to be very helpful for everyone. And for ordinary Ukrainian believers, this visit became truly vicarious. However, for Ukrainian Christians, the Vatican's diplomacy carried not only light, but also shadows. The latter came with the beginning of the pontificate of Pope Paul VI, from which the period of the so-called Vatican's Ostpolitik began. Since that time, the Ukrainian policy of the Vatican has been a pale derivative of its Russian policy. In the optics of Ostpolitik, Ukraine and its churches have always been considered troublemakers. Subjectivity of Ukrainians did not fit into Russia-oriented models, since Moscow did not recognize our subjectivity. Let me give you one extraordinary example. Vatican functionaries were almost entirely silent at the manifestation of authentic spirituality on the Maidan. The protest in Kiev and throughout the countries in late the year 2013 and early 14. Simple people turned to spiritual values. There was a desire to overcome corruption. Kiev's Independence Square, the Maidan, was a place of daily prayers, night vigils, and conversions to the faith. The Maidan was a site of ecumenism and interreligious cooperation on human dignity. That is, there was a public consensus of all Christians, Jews, and Muslims of Ukraine. However, all these have earned not a single explicit word of support from Curia. Why? Because these events happened in the Moscow Patriarchate sphere of interest. So the Vatican diplomats made a taboo of any real support of Ukraine's revolution of dignity. It seemed the diplomats had an excessive influence on the Holy See's decisions. At moments like this, you feel that the Vatican diplomat corps as a center of power has overrode the role of the Vatican as a spiritual center. For too long, the Vatican had refused to take a position about Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. For too long, the Vatican was equating the roles of Russia and Ukraine in the current conflict and spoke about it in a neutral way as a fratricidal fighting among Christians. And even after the beginning of a mass intervention of Russia, Pope Francis refused to specify the aggressor by name and to admit the injustice of its invasion of a sovereign nation. I understand, as the head of the Vatican City State, the Pope has to be a careful diplomat. However, as I told Pope Francis during the audience in June, it is the Bishop of Rome who is a spiritual leader for Ukrainians, not the head of the state. Therefore, I'm sure it's rather dangerous that diplomacy and reluctance to spoil relations with Moscow has invaded the domain of the Catholic faith. What we Ukrainians expect from the Pope is truth and justice. And the language of diplomacy is neutrality and security. I have two motivations for criticizing the Vatican's position on the Ukrainian question. First of all, as Pope Francis has said, we should look on the Church sins and imperfections as on those of our own mother. So the mistakes of my mother, the Church, pain me and I must speak. Therefore, I will speak with respect for the Pope, who himself bravely speaks the truth to which he witnesses. Secondly, in my own life, I have paid for defending the truth at the cost of 10 years deprivation of freedom in the Soviet Gulag. So I know that faithfulness to the truth and justice is a higher value than one's own security or peaceful prosperity. I'm sure today this principle is also valid. Diplomacy is a legitimate part of church life. However, for diplomacy, centers of power have the priority. However, it is difficult to imagine something more contradictory to Christ's ministry than absolutizing centers of power. Can you imagine Jesus prioritizing his relations with power holders of his time over people's passion for truth and justice. So let me conclude with the following statement. With the beginning of the Russian war in Ukraine, the whole system of the world inter-church relations faces the urgent need of change. The Catholic Church must radically rethink its position on ecumenism, cleansing it of false stereotypes and harmful inertia. It became entirely clear that the formula dialogue at any cost is ruinous. Ecumenical dialogue cannot be preserved at the cost of denying the truth and justice. On the contrary, this is the best way to ruin it. It became clear also that the inertial traditions of the Vatican's Ostpolitik became unbearable for Ukrainians now. It is high time and an urgent need for the Vatican to formulate a genuine Ukrainian policy, a policy with a primary focus on Ukraine, not a secondary one. Ukraine is not an object. Today, it sacrificed dearly for its subjectivity, its God-given dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vice Rector Marinovic. Thank you, Miroslav. Talking about Vatican diplomacy, the light as in John Paul II's visit in 2001, and the shadow as in the silence of the Vatican after and during the Revolution of Dignity or in the current conflict, where, as you said, diplomacy speaks the language of neutrality and security, and our faith asks for the question or the language of truth and justice. Distinguished panelists, we have about 15 minutes for questions. A number of questions have already come in. May I please direct the questions to specific panelists and ask you for rather brief responses, if I may. I would like to direct the first question to Ambassador Plebde and to Lord David. And the question is, it's in German, so I just summarize it. Do you think that the West has made a mistake in the way they treated Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Was there some kind of triumphalism in the West, which is now part of the situation that we are facing? Ambassador Plebde, and then after that, Lord Alton, any wisdom you have to share on this question?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's good question. There were 3 decades, I think, since the collapse of Soviet Union and how it's treated. The intention of the Western were very good as well, I think, to have contacts and to have Russia to participate in rules-based international order and nowadays. So it was, I think it was good attempts and necessary attempts as well, and people to people and contacts and everything. But to see them and Yeltsin's Russia, I think, was a bit also different than Putin's Russia. Russia was not static. I mean, it was evolving, and I think all of us expected to evolve in the different direction than it did. But it's a question when you see this change, qualitative change. There was Chechnya wars, 2008, Georgian war, then 2014 annexation of Crimea. Now what we have, so it's always, I think, always Western had this hope that something we can talk and something would happen, but we see, so that was, I think, good intentions, but probably they had to be. What is now we are facing is not, I think, what we have eyes open, what is real Russia is, how we have to do that and to deal the sanction and everything. What we also know, the European dependence on this naivety to have cheap energy coming from Russia or something. Yes, Westerns were not prepared. They were too late to realize what Russia is and how we have to deal. So now we will be paying higher price than we had paid if we had been realizing this change a bit earlier.
Thank you, Excellency. Lord Alton, do you think that Russia has been, quote unquote, humiliated by the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and has this played a role in where we are now?
I think the period after 1989 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall and then the collapse of the whole Soviet Empire has been a period of missed opportunities. And I think that we think back to the period of Yeltsin and recently the obituaries of Gorbachev have been read, I think, with great care and interest by people wondering why it was that the man that Margaret Thatcher famously said was a man she could do business with, why did it all go wrong? But then you look at the first years of Putin, and he looked as though he might be willing to do business with the West and open the way for a more democratic society. But read things like Bill Browder's book and the killing of his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, and you can see that instead of the rule of law, we end up with almost the rule of the mob. And instead of the kind of values that people have been yearning for throughout much of the former Soviet Empire, they've ended up with something that is totally autocratic, that is increasingly dictatorial, and is based on this illusion that Putin has been trying to sell to his own people, propagandizing them about the lost empire, and that the people of the lost empire want to come back to Mother Russia. And I think gradually, if it weren't for the massive control over the media in Russia, I think that the sort of thing we heard this week from Alla Pugacheva, who is often called the Russian Dolly Parton, she castigated Putin publicly for what she called the deaths of our Russian boys. So we've got to be careful not to assume that all Russians necessarily hold the same views or have the same mentality as Putin. I suspect that many more, if they have the opportunity to express it as Alla Pugacheva has done, but if more people have the opportunity to express their hopes freely, I think they would want to look westward. And I think that they would want the same freedoms that people were demanding before the fall of the Berlin Wall and hoped for in Russia. So I don't think hope is dead in Russia. Or the sight of these young people trying to get out of the country so that they don't have to join Putin's conscripts. This isn't going according to plan in any sense whatsoever. So who knows, if another opportunity presents itself, and if there are new leaders, for instance, come into the Kremlin, that can go one of two ways as well. I mean, we always hope for something better. Of course, it could be people even more nationalistic, even more sort of almost fascistic in the kind of attitudes and values that they embrace. So we have to hope that there'll be more liberal-minded people who will want democratic values, and we should be ready to ensure we engage properly and diplomatically with them if such an opportunity appears.
Thank you, Lord Alton. Which brings me to another question, which I would like to direct to Ambassador Robinson and Vice Rector Marinovic. And the question is, are there any good actors in Russia with whom we and Ukraine might talk and negotiate? If there are, how does one find them? Are they not a serious risk from Putin and the oligarchs and military? So are there any good actors in Russia? Maybe Ambassador Robinson first and then Miroslav?
Well, I would simply piggyback on what Lord David had said. Yes, clearly there are, and there are some very courageous people in Russia, and I think that we have to be very careful not to demonize a people. This is the behavior of at this point, I'd have to just say, deranged individual, terribly isolated, wielding an enormous amount of power, who's grossly miscalculated what he's about, and has power that is at this moment untouchable, I guess. But yeah, I think that the effort should be made to try to understand better the aspirations of most of the Russian people, and to align whatever carrots we have with those aspirations, so that we can help them realize their ambition against this kind of autocracy. Yeah, I think that the real danger here is falling into the trap of demonizing an entire population and saying that Russia bad, West good. That's just a crazy way to go about business here.
Thank you, Ambassador Robinson. Miroslav, are there any good actors in Russia?
Well, I'm sure there are some people in Russia in higher levels that are critical toward Putin's policy, but critical from what positions? That's the point. And we in Ukraine are afraid of negotiating with people who, first of all, might be more nationalistic than Putin himself and more dangerous, but also at the same time that they may still think in a way of supporting big Russia. But we Ukrainians these days compare the situation with Russia with the situation with Germany in the middle of the 20th century. Did the West have a good context in Germany in 1943? Good German context appeared especially after the collapse of Nazi Germany, after the defeat of Nazi Germany. Then it was the reason for many Germans to reconsider the idea of their statehood. The same situation with Russia. We do not believe that any leadership of Russia within the Russian Empire, re-established Russian Empire, might be helpful in negotiation with Ukraine.
Okay, thank you, Miroslav. I would like, and again, please brief responses. I would like to direct the next question to both Ambassador Plepte and to Ambassador Robinson. And the question is, to what extent is it important for Western nations to work via diplomatic channels for a peaceful end? How should diplomats coordinate between their respective State Departments and Ukraine in these discussions with Russian diplomats? From a diplomatic perspective, to what extent is Russia a reliable or unreliable actor, someone who can be trusted to hold firm to their agreements? So it's the coordination of Western diplomacy with Ukraine and Russia. That's the question. Ambassador Plepte, please.
I think I mentioned already that I think there was a big success of US leadership and diplomacy to pulling this wide coalition of like-minded in support of Ukraine, and what we witness as well, so many visits to Ukraine in support of Ukraine and having, yes, so here Ukraine, I would say central. We have to maintain those contacts and really to be helping them and keeping together the Western alliance together as well as we were now, not to have that energy prices and other, this natural sometimes fatigue happens, would not prevent us to being together or and looking what is the best mean to help Ukraine and to see that they would win. It's not, I think it's a fear that sometimes we believe that diplomacy and contacts are good per se, that we are perceiving diplomacy that is that. But I think we have to see what we want to achieve that. So, and we have to achieve, I think, that really the victory of Ukraine in that sense. Just
thank you, Your Excellency. Yeah. Thank you. Briefly, Dave Robinson, please.
The short answer is no. I don't think there are effective or influential Russian diplomats who will honor their agreements at this point, in so far as they're responding to Vladimir Putin. Secondly, I think what's important is that we marry diplomacy to the threat and the actual use of force. In this case, force is to continue to arm the Ukraine, to provide the Ukraine with the kinds of weapons it needs to be effective against the Russian invasion, and to make sure that our diplomacy walks in lockstep with that, to back, to a certain extent, them into a corner while always leaving a back door open. But I think that's it's important to marry our diplomacy with strength and a willingness to use the strength we have.
Thank you so much. I'm looking at the watch. We have 3 minutes, and I would say let's move the last question to Miroslav Marinovic and Lord Alton. I know that Lord Alton is a Roman Catholic, and so and then Miroslav is also Ukrainian Catholic. And the question is about the role of peace in this situation. So the question I got was, we have the sign of peace during the Catholic liturgy, and how important is this kind of offer in the situation that we are facing? Maybe Lord Alton first and then Miroslav, because I read your articles on the Stations of the Cross in Rome. Lord Alton, please.
You never give up on peace, of course. In 1988, when I went into Ukraine, I got arrested and kept overnight by the Soviet troops who picked me up from the station. They let me in the following day. I would not have believed what I saw, not just in Ukraine, but in Romania, Albania, in Germany, in Poland, in the former Soviet Union. I wouldn't have believed that within a year I would see the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the extraordinary changes that took place. But there couldn't have been peace without justice. And I come back to what I said earlier on, Clemens, about crimes against humanity, genocide.
Yeah.
People have to be held to account for these things. There was a Nuremberg moment at the end of the Second World War. And whatever happens now, people must be brought to justice. There cannot be peace. There can't be reconciliation without justice as well.
Thank you. That's very clear. Thank you. Miroslav, the last word. Please be brief and clear as always.
Yes, I would like only to thank Lord Alton for this concept of just peace. We Ukrainians are very afraid about peace, which would not be just.
Yeah.
For example, we may imagine peace that will leave part of our territory in hands of Russians. It would not be just peace.
Yeah.
Or even peace that the whole Ukrainian territory is back to Ukraine, but Russia has right to shoot rockets to Ukrainian territory and destroy our economy.
Yeah.
So you see, there are many situations when we Ukrainians are afraid of.
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you, Miroslav. So what I took away from this panel, thank you, dear panelists, there were huge successes in diplomacy given the Western unification with the sanctions. There's a continuing need for this kind of diplomacy. There were failures on the side of Russian diplomacy, and there cannot be really diplomatic negotiations with the current regime in Russia. We are at time. I want to thank our distinguished panelists. We've learned so much. I want to thank the audience for your interest in your questions. We want to thank our colleagues who made this virtual panel possible, especially Tim Checkley, Grant Osborne, Grania McEvoy, Jen Lektansky, and Becca Prince. And I always end our events for Ukraine with a statement of our university president, John Jenkins, on the day of the Russian invasion, where he said, "The former oppressors of Ukraine are now known by another name and are waging war under a different flag. But the trauma is no less today than in the past in this nation that has suffered far too much. Now, more than ever, our friends in Ukraine are in need of healing and hope. We at Notre Dame stand in solidarity with all peace-loving people worldwide in demanding an end to this invasion of a sovereign state. This unprovoked war is an international abomination and must stop now. Until it does, may God keep safe all of the innocent men, women, and children who are currently in harm's way. The prayers of the Notre Dame family are with them." With these prayers for peace, we from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies want to wish you all a good and safe afternoon. Thank you.